Everybody, welcome back to Behind the Harvest podcast. We're so glad that you have decided to join us whenever and wherever you're joining us from. Thanks for making us a part of your day. If you'd do a favor, subscribe here on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, we'd also love for you to share this podcast with anybody that you think would enjoy it or get something out of it. We are going to continue to talk a little bit about politics, culture, and the counterculture, but I got a couple of guests joining us today. I got Chase and Kayla. Hello, everyone.
Hey, everybody.
We're actually all in the same house, just different rooms. So just if you wanted to know, we're all stationed out in various rooms. So it's a fun time over here trying to get the sound going. But, we really wanted to kick this podcast back up and do it in some video form so people could see us as we were doing it, and also in audio form. And we are going through a series at Harvest Church about, kind of politics and culture and the space between us. And so one of the ideas this past couple of weeks has been that the church is a counterculture. It was a counterculture in the first century. And the first century church, it was kind of like this puzzle piece that didn't fit. And I think the same rings true today when you think about the various values that the church has versus various values that some of our political leaders have, as well as the culture, and that, the church actually doesn't necessarily fit into one spectrum or the other if we were to take a biblical worldview. So when we think about counterculture, what does that mean to you guys when you think about the church should be a counterculture?
I think for me, it is just being different. What the church should be. I think I said it last week, but when Christ changes us, we should do our best to show the evidence of that change to the world. And a lot of times that's how we respond in intense times, like election years have been the last decade or so, how intense election times have been, and how we have seen Christians really kind of show out on some things, and we should we should be different than that. We're called to a higher standard, and we have a greater purpose than that.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Kayla?
I agree with that. I think a lot of times in the context of counterculture, you have to look at what Jesus did. And a lot of times that is ministering to people you would not think to minister to.
Yes.
It is choosing, well, he chose his disciples. We don't, but picking people that don't fit the mold, and it's not even like the life mold or whatever. It's like, he didn't pick overly religious people either. Like, he was this guy that had just this aura about him, but at the same time, like, he knew how to handle those things within the culture of the time, and he didn't panic about it. And even, in his divinity and humanity, he had this even keel, I know how to refer to the scriptures, I know how to handle this, and I seek God in prayer if I don't, and if I have uncertainty. So that's what I think counterculture really looks like in my mind.
Yeah, there's like characteristics of how the first century church was the counterculture, but one of the things that you just said that I think is important is how leaders and how Jesus selected people. And so, like, when you go into the church, actually, I have to tell this story. My wife went to this neighborhood gathering, and they did Robert Rules of Order. And they were voting, and somebody said, "Oh, wait, you have to have a second, and you have to have that." And, if you're in the church in America and you've been in church in America, and a lot of people are really disenfranchised with the church in America because the church has really married itself to look a lot like politics as far as business meetings, how it handles things, and then also how it selects its leaders. Well, who has the best resume? Who's been successful in this?
Yeah.
Who's done this? And we think that those people should be great on boards. And when you think about how the church was ran and operated in the first century and how the church is designed to run and operate, really both of those business meetings and Robert rules of order and all that kind of stuff, and who was chosen, people were chosen based on their character, based on who they were in their family life, based on who they were as fathers, as who they were as mothers, based on their character, what they were thought about in the community. Did they have an upstanding reputation in the community? And what's interesting is, while I was not anticipating to go here for the podcast, is that we have become accustomed to marrying cultural norms with the church norms, when in reality, how we make decisions and who makes those decisions are actually very countercultural when we look biblically versus what we see in our culture in the church today, especially in America.
Mm. Mm.
That's a word, man.
I wasn't ready for that today, but let me tell you something. That was good. That was good. We have done a good job of, I think, especially, we have done a great job of marrying, like you said, cultural norms to the church, and a lot of times they don't walk together. They're not supposed to walk together.
A lot of times when you look through that lens, you lose the, hey, let's not slander. Hey, let's not, like, let's keep our counterculture and keep our values in the model of Christ. And the reason why we lose it is because it becomes political.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, you gotta vote in the deacons and have a second and have business meeting and all this stuff, and all of a sudden you lose the humanity of people. All of a sudden you lose the mission and the vision, and you're more focused on hierarchies and industrialization of the church, if you will, than the actual, like, what model did the first century church present? And that was literally boots on the ground, mission driven, in the trenches with people that don't look like me.
Well, yeah, when you put the vote piece out, it naturally creates a culture of politicking behind the scenes, right? I want this person in because they will represent what I want to see the vision of the church as. So I'm going to try to get as many people to vote for them as possible. I want this person. I want to nominate this person because I've known them for a long time. And because we do a really great job of hiding what's going on behind the scenes. So we present ourselves a certain way with people, but we do a really poor job we do a really great job of hiding really what our character is like behind the scenes, how we treat our spouse, how we steward our money, all those types of things. And so we are voting people in based on what we see in a very small percentage of the time, right? Not exactly what we see behind closed doors. And so when we think about the church as a counterculture, I think that's one area that the church is a counterculture in. It should be a church. The church should be a counterculture as far as who is in leadership, what gets them in leadership, and we talk about a lot. The faithful, available, and the teachable people. And so, are there people that are faithful, available, and teachable? What are the qualifications? But I think there's other things too, that the church is the countercultural to our society. And that's, I think, in the area of multi-ethnic. And we as the church have not done a great job. Somebody once said that the most divided hour of the week in America is on Sunday mornings. And when you think about it historically, and when you think about it around the world, the church is actually the most diverse organization in the entire world, all tongues, tribes, and nations. But especially our church in America, we're very, very divided around worship styles, around who we're reaching, around who gets to come in and who doesn't get to come in. And I think, especially with the emerging generations, that's an area that I think we have to figure out how we can improve in that area to be welcoming, even as a church that's predominantly white and Caucasian. How do we welcome in other cultures and other ethnicities to where they feel comfortable to worship with us? What are the things that we're praying for, doing to say, hey, but we're welcoming you,
Chase, I know you've had a lot of experience. We've had a lot of conversations about stuff like this, and you visited a lot of um, ethnic churches and AME churches and all that. You also have talked to me about how you went to school with a pretty diverse group of people too.
Yeah. Allison, my wife Allison, and I both. It's very near to our heart to see for the church that we worship in and serve, to look like what we think heaven will be one day, and that is all nations represented. And I know sometimes that's not physically possible, but it is near to me. Diversity in that sense is important to me because I love to see all styles of worship represented. I love to see all kinds of people represented, and not just kinds of people as in the color of their skin, but people from all walks of life coming to one place to worship the same God. I think is so important. Um, for example, our worship team, we have folks that grew up in New York or were here and there, and it Sunday God kind of spoke to me and was like, you have all these people, and somehow I found them all and brought them here to Conway so that you all could work together. And so I think diversity in the aspect of ethnicity is important. I think diversity in background is important as well, to show anybody that comes in this church, God loves you, and there's people here that look like me who have the same kind of upbringing or background as me. And I know the background and the stories, don't are not visible at first sight,
Yeah.
but and I don't think we should do it to meet a quota. Obviously, I think it's so much more than that. I think that it's important for I think church should look like what heaven's going to look like one day, and that'll be all nations, tongues, and tribes,
Yeah.
and all those labels when we get to heaven will be removed, and it's just going to be redeemed, but I think it's important for church to be that way. And I think, of course, historically we've been divided, and that goes back hundreds of years, and my prayer is to see some of that broken. So
I mean, it's like, this is one of the aspects where I would say starting in the late 80s, early 90s, the culture started moving a little bit more toward what you saw with multi-ethnic churches and ethnicity. Because, as I was growing up, the emergence of pop culture and with hip hop, rap, sneaker culture, those types of things, making it into the suburbs, was very prevalent. And so it began to create a little bit different of a perspective of those things and more African American culture, and which opened up to multiple cultures, especially with millennials, and then working its way onto Gen Z and even younger kids. It really started with us millennials, where popular things in African American culture made its way into. I mean, the first CD that I ever had was Crisscross, Make You Jump, right? I mean, that's the first CD ever bought. And a lot of people listening to this may not know what that was, but a lot of people will remember what that means.
I'm gonna have to Google that one when we get done.
Well, and then sneaker culture, right? Like Air Jordans and things like that. And so it opened the door for the younger generations to begin to realize, wait a second, there actually isn't really any reason for us to be divided. We actually can mix the cultures, and it's actually not bad, whether it be in worship. I mean, to the point where we play hip hop rap music, Christian hip hop music before service, right? Yeah. Well, why do we do that? Well, that's what I like to listen to. That's what a lot of people like to listen to. Our age. So those kind of cultural shifts have really opened the door for maybe not a whole lot of change yet, but at least a whole lot of realization for there to be change.
Yeah.
And that we can interweave these cultures and still have an amazing worship experience. And really, honestly, is a preparation for heaven, because you're going to have all these different types of things represented in heaven, in worship.
I have something to say on this, and I love the Lord and I love how He works. Right? Okay. Because I was. Let me share the story, and then I'll tell you where it came up just a week or so ago.
Yeah.
Back in maybe 2003 ish, 2002, 2003.
Were you even born
when
yet?
you were 4?
I was like 3. Okay, I get it, but I know this because I found out later in life. But I guess necessarily back in the late 80s and early 90s, Bill Gaither started doing a lot of videos with popular gospel artists of that time. And he was always really good about having various styles. He would have, of course, the traditional quartet sound, the Southern gospel sound, and his group specifically was really big. The group that he had or has still was always really good about bringing newer sounds, and he'd have contemporary artists come in. Like at that time, it was like Sandy Patty and Ray Boltz and people like that. But in 2002 or 3, he did he was doing like studio videos and then took it live when things just got bigger. But he did a night at the Potter's House with Bishop T.D. Jakes, and he had Southern gospel, contemporary worship music of that time, black gospel. He had all these different styles of music represented. He had legendary black gospel artists. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Mom Winans was there. Tremaine Hawkins. Lord, I can't think in my head all of the names that Jesse Dixon, Dorinda Clark, people like that. And then he had all of the people that he had close relationships with and traveled with them and toured them or whatever. And they had a whole night built around, and from that night, they got 2 albums worth of songs. One was called We Will Stand, and one was called Build a Bridge. And in between the live songs, the tapings and recordings of live, he would go afterward and do B-roll footage. And he did an interview with Bishop Jakes, and Jake said, I grew up in West Virginia, and I've been in little country churches where, everyone had on blue jeans and overalls and cowboy boots, and you were worldly if you had on a tie, And he said, and I've been in, great cathedrals, those kind of things. He said, but I think what God has been trying to teach us all along, he said, it's not about if your style's right or if my style's right or this one or that one's right. He said, I think he wants us to do what nature does, and that is to borrow the nectar from other flowers so that all of us become more fruitful.
Yeah.
And preach, man.
And when you and I think in that mindset, if we say it's not about you being right, it's not about me being right, it's about how can we reach reach people that otherwise wouldn't come to my church or to your church? What can we do? And the first step is for us to stop arguing over who's right and who's wrong.
That's right.
And the second step is to borrow from each other so that we can be more fruitful.
That's right.
All of us can be more fruitful.
Yeah.
I think it's time to reverse some poor theology on some people's parts, because I've heard, living in the Bible Belt, living in the South, you hear a lot of times people need to stay racially divided. Like a lot of people are like, oh, it's totally biblical to not have interracial marriage, and that's not true at all. I have no idea where you would pull that from Scripture.
You're gonna
Um,
make some people mad, Kayla. You're gonna make some
I
people
know.
mad.
Look, you have told me many a times if my shoes get stepped on, if my toes get stepped on, I'm gonna shine my shoes later.
Yep.
But
Take your
I
Clorox
think
wipe to them sneakers. That'd be just right. They'll be all
I
right.
think that's so important, and I also think when we mend the gap and we build that bridge, like a lot of people look at me funny because I wear Jordan sneakers, you know, because they're like that doesn't necessarily fit your culture, and I'm like
Well,
I'm
imagine being 42 and wearing them.
you know,
Yeah.
but if you like a lot of people believe that racism isn't a thing. A lot of people believe it's an Americanized thing. There's varying opinions about things, and the reality is that it was an issue in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
When Jesus and his disciples traveled throughout, if they went to a certain area, so they're dominantly doing ministry in the Sea of Galilee or around that area. Like Jesus was not welcome in Nazareth, which is where he's from. He goes to somewhere like Syria, or he's traveling downward, and then all of a sudden they're getting spit on when they're walking down the street. They're like, "Jew, what are you doing here?" And then you have the story of the Good Samaritan. That's a racial issue. The
Mm.
reason why the other person didn't stop is because they were of a different race. But Jesus teaches the color of your skin does not matter. Your culture, if it's different than somebody else's, that does not matter
Mm-hmm.
because we can all learn from one another. And I think it's very important. Like I always go back to that model of how Jesus lived his life because he shows us that stuff. And I honestly think, unfortunately, racism will probably always be an issue. And it boils down to a lot of things. One, it is a learned behavior, and a lot of people don't undo, poor theology or, not so great line of thinking, or it makes them uncomfortable or whatever that is. But as we like strive to be counterculture, how can we help, put an end to things like that? I
Mm-hmm.
want I want somebody that's not white to be able to come to our church and say, "You know what? This is absolutely incredible. I feel so welcome here even though I don't look like everybody else." And to the people that attend our church, I'm going to just say, it is so hard to stay in a place like that where sometimes you don't feel like you fit, but you are valued in that.
Yeah.
And we are glad you're here. It's
Well,
awesome.
and that's one of the characteristics, right, that made the first century church so unique and so countercultural is because they were bridge builders. They modeled civility. They modeled building bridges. They modeled accepting people, right? They modeled forgiveness. They modeled, all of those things was modeled in the first century church, despite being persecuted or despite being different or despite risking being outcasts. And I think it made it one of the things that made it very welcoming for all cultures and all ethnicities. And it's exactly what we talk about, that the identity was really in who they were in Christ,
Mm-hmm.
not in what their background was, language was, what their ethnicity was. And I think that that's really where we have a great opportunity as the church to remember Galatians 3. I think it's 26 through 29, but Galatians 3, where Paul writes about how it's our identity in Christ that should be the primary identifier for people in the church. And we have a culture, though, that tries to divide us up based on our identity, based on our background, based on our ethnicity, based on our race, very similar to the Roman culture of the day that the first century church was in. They would put them in categories, and you're in this category, and you're in this category, and if you're in this category, then you should vote like this, or you should act like this, you should eat this, you should do that, instead of like the day of Pentecost, right, where all of these various ethnicities are represented, and they're celebrated, and they're seen as an asset, and they're seen as a part of God's unique creation. and they're also seen as everybody's brothers and sisters under the banner of who they are, sons and daughters of Christ, right? And so you've got like a tremendous opportunity in a, which is interesting, in a world that wants to celebrate diversity, yet also wants to keep people in diverse categories, right? They want to celebrate diversity by putting them in categories, not celebrating diversity by bringing people together and being bridge builders. And that's a great opportunity that we have as the church to be that, right? Especially in a world that values. I just think about like, what is the picture that the world sees if they come in, and I'm just thankful that we have all a lot of various ethnicities and races represented at Harvest Church. I'm just grateful for that, right? And I would pray that we would have more and more and more. So, we're to be a counterculture. So what we'll do is for our next episode next week is we'll come back and we'll continue to talk about counterculture. We'll do a counterculture part 2, kind of hit some of these other things because there's some pretty, I think, important things that we can glean from the first century church and how they were countercultural that are also very applicable to our culture today. So we appreciate you checking us out. We'd love for you to like, subscribe, share the podcast if you found any value in it. And so until next week, we'll see you then.